Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast. Hunter is joining me today. H, thanks for being here.
Autumn, not only am I joining you today, I think I'm carrying you today because we are recording at a time that's later in the day than we typically do. And usually we're perky, we're bright, and we've had our coffee, but we're recording in the late afternoon today. And I have to say to our listeners, you're dragging a little bit.
Yeah, that's very self-congratulatory of you. Thank you so much for carrying me through this conversation.
Well, I only carry because I care.
Yes. Thank you. All right. Well, it is the afternoon. That part is true. And this conversation also began a few minutes ago by you saying, you know what you're really worried about for yourself, I believe, is that we typically record this in the morning. Today, it's Thursday afternoon, and there's a podcast episode between us and the end of the workday. So we care about our listeners. We're going to do our best. Hunter's thankfully going to carry me through this conversation. Can't wait.
I just wanted to give you an out. If you're a little bit loopy, I just wanted our listeners to know why Autumn is not sharp as a tack.
Great.
Today.
Thank you. It's going to be really obvious because most of our episodes, we are so sharp, right? So today, if I'm not quite as sharp, then that's why.
That's right.
All right.
That's right.
Well, today we are discussing a listener's question. Every week we invite questions, and sometimes some of you take us up on that offer.
We love it when you do.
We love it when you do. So today we have a Q&R episode, and we're talking about decision-making and God's will. And shall I just begin by reading our listener's question?
Yeah.
All right. Here's the question. I recently read Mark Vrogop's book, Waiting Isn't a Waste, which talks about waiting on God as integral to the Christian life. Waiting is a reminder that we aren't ultimately in control of our lives and an opportunity to trust in the certainty of God in an uncertain season or situation. At the same time, many people advise action as the solution for complex situations we face. For instance, if a single person desires to be married, people suggest that the right action to take is to try online dating, try local meetups, etc. How do you discern times to trust God's sovereignty versus intervene through human action?
Well, I just want to say that's spoken like someone who has received that advice. So
sure
I don't know the question or situation, but it sounds like someone has been advised to try online dating, try meetups, etc., and is tired of that advice and now wants to know what you think about it.
Maybe so.
Yep.
That could be, yes.
Well, this is a great question because it illustrates something that a lot of us, I think, deal with, not just in the standpoint of if you're single and you want to be in a relationship or you want to be married, but with a lot of things in life, it usually this question comes up when our circumstance is not what we would hope it would be. It's not ideally what we want it to be. And yet maybe we feel like we have tried things and it hasn't changed. And so we kind of fall back on waiting on God as this questioner writes. We fall back on waiting on God to act. And I think what is being asked here is like, is that okay? Is it okay just to kind of at some point, if there's something you would like to change in your life or something that you wish was different, is it okay just to fall back on, well, I've just got to now wait on God and trust Him? Or should I always be doing more to try to change the circumstance? So I think it's a real question many people wrestle with.
I haven't read the book that's referenced. I don't believe you have either. So we're not going to speak specifically to what Mark Vrogop's book discusses. We'll stick within the parameters of what the question outlines for us. But yeah, I agree, Hunter. I think that the person who sent in this question is wrestling with is an exercise of human agency in a given situation, an indication that I'm not necessarily trusting God in it, Or if I have tried some things and I'm weary of that, maybe, for instance, I have tried online dating already and it's been tough. It's a slog. There are many difficult, hard, perhaps even discouraging and bad things about it. And so I want to pray about it, express this desire to God. But so often the colloquial wisdom says, well, if you want your situation to change, you've got to take active steps to change it. So how are we both trusting God in the situation and then discerning when to exercise agency in it, which I think is a question that biblical wisdom addresses.
Yeah. Well, you said biblical wisdom. That's where my mind went as I was reading this question. The wisdom literature of the Old Testament, I think, is directly addressing, in some cases, situations like this. I've been spending a lot of time in wisdom literature because I'm preached Proverbs for a couple of series last year. I'm kind of ramping up for a couple of series this year to preach some more in Proverbs, and so I've spent some time in the wisdom literature. But my mind actually went to Ecclesiastes. This is a big theme in Ecclesiastes, and my mind went to even a few passages in Ecclesiastes that get to this. But to step back, biblical wisdom is about making ethical, or you could say moral decisions. And when we say ethical and moral decisions, we don't just mean things that are right or wrong. Like, did God say I shall do this and I shall not do this? But we also mean everything that we know is weighted with moral categories, like there's good, there's better, there's best. And someone is probably thinking like, I want God's best, or I want to make a decision that's going to lead to life and to flourishing best I can. And so these are moral decisions that they get to the idea that we are put in God's world. God made the world to work a certain way. Blessing tends to flow when we live within the way he made the world to work. So even the question of, should I date this person or not date this person, is a moral and ethical decision, in that we have to factor in the character of the other person and who they are and how that's going to shape us. And so even if it's not a clear-cut right or wrong, it's still weighted with those kinds of questions. And so biblical wisdom is given to us to make ethical, moral decisions and to navigate the ethical, moral, relational dimensions of life where we don't necessarily have a clear, here's the law, you must obey in this situation. So that's where my mind went. This is a question that I would expect the wisdom literature to help me to think about.
In what way does Ecclesiastes help you respond to this particular question? When you mention Ecclesiastes, I start to think, what do I know about that book? Well, in some ways, that book is an illustration of a king who exercised, a teacher who exercised some agency in ways that weren't ultimately fruitful and probably were not within God's will. So there's that illustration from Ecclesiastes. In what way does Ecclesiastes come to mind as speaking directly to this situation?
Ecclesiastes is a reflection on the life of Solomon, or it's based on the life of Solomon. And there's some debate among scholars, and these are good evangelical scholars, who believe in the authority of Scripture. They believe in the historicity of Scripture. They will debate whether this was actually written by Solomon or whether it was written by the author will sometimes identify himself as the teacher. The Hebrew term is Kohelet, the teacher, Q-U-O, Kohelet, the teacher. And so they'll debate, is the author Solomon himself, or is the author some later writer who has kind of adopted this Solomonic persona, and he's based on Solomon's life, he's drawing lessons, but either way, the life of Solomon went like this. Solomon sought God early in his reign for wisdom. In fact, God asked him what he wanted, and he said, I want wisdom to govern your people. And God was so pleased with that he not only gave Solomon wisdom, but he also blessed Solomon with immense prosperity. And then as he got in later into his reign, his heart started to drift from the Lord as he became wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. And the Scriptures particularly tell us that he married a bunch of foreign wives. It wasn't uncommon for kings to take multiple wives, but he took, I think it was 1,000 wives, or it was like 700 wives and 300 concubines, or 300 wives and 700 concubines. The numbers are escaped me, but 1,000, that's a lot.
It's a lot.
He took 1,000, and these all become part of his harem and at his palace. And over time, Scripture says some of his wives led his heart away from the Lord. And later in his life, he drifted from the heart for God and the wisdom for God that he had earlier in life. And so Ecclesiastes takes this life of Solomon and reflects on it. And the Kohelet, or Solomon, says in Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanity, all is vanities, meaning I have given my life to many things. It's now reflecting as an older man, I've given my life to things that ultimately did not prove to be worthwhile or lasting or satisfying or enduring. And so we see right here how the moral dimensions of life start to play out. He made certain decisions. Some of them were foolish, and some of them were well beyond what God had commanded. And he bore consequences for that, and he kind of returns to his senses later in life, and Ecclesiastes is the reflection on that. So that's the background of Ecclesiastes. It is really about the question of how do you live a meaningful, purposeful life. The Kohelet in Ecclesiastes also begins to reflect on what we might call the mystery of life, and the mystery of life is there's also some things that are beyond your control, such that even if you do everything right, there's a whole dimension of what your life becomes that you don't directly control through your actions. So that's why my mind went to Ecclesiastes as I was reflecting on this question.
There's something you said there that I think is a good question for us to ask as we enter into this conversation. And that's, you said, reflecting on what is a good or meaningful life. And so we could ask it this way: how do I live well and wisely in God's world? And I think that's applicable, definitely, in this illustration from Ecclesiastes, and then to the question that we're asking today. Even though our questioner may be asking about how do you apply this in some specific situations, there's a broader application principle here that we can all ask of Ecclesiastes and what the teacher is helping us see through this story.
That's right, and I'll bring it down now one level of specificity. There's two big themes that run through Ecclesiastes, and both of these themes have to do with what I might call God's will. The Ecclesiastes doesn't necessarily use those terms, God's will, but God's will is spoken about in two different ways in Ecclesiastes. One way we might just call God's commanded will, and God's commanded will is both his law and his wisdom. It is what we can read in the Bible. It tells us this is the path of life, this is the path that leads to death or that leads to foolishness. It includes his law, so his clear, obvious commands, the thou shalt and the thou shalt nots, but it also includes biblical wisdom, which is how do you choose in a way that leads to life when the law doesn't directly speak to that choice that you have to face. Some of the questions we deal with, like, should I date this person? Should I marry this person? Should I take this job? There could be an instance where the law of God speaks to that. Like if the job is a job that would require me to commit some fraud or to steal, then clearly God's law would forbid me from taking that job and doing that job. But if the job is within kind of the moral demands of God's law, then I still have to make the choice, like, is this the best job for me, or is this the best job right now for me to take? And is this a place I want to work or whatnot? So wisdom deals with that. We might call all of that, both the law and making wisdom decisions, we might call that God's commanded will. And the point of God's commanded will is this: there's stuff in his word that helps us navigate those choices and decisions and tells us what to do. So that's God's will for your life is commanded right there in Scripture. But there's a second way that Ecclesiastes starts to talk about God's will, and it's a huge theme in the book, and we might call this his sovereign will. And God's sovereign will is that God ordains, or some would say just allows, whatever comes to pass. And whatever comes to pass has both good and bad dimensions. And there are some things that God allows to come to pass that at the same time are not what he commands, and in fact are against what he commands. This is the classic question of like, God has allowed evil to exist in the world for a while, even though he doesn't command or desire evil. So what do you do with that? And the author of Ecclesiastes wrestles with God's sovereign will as well as God's commanded will. And so sometimes in Ecclesiastes, he will emphasize the goodness of keeping and living by God's commanded will. And sometimes in Ecclesiastes, he will emphasize that God has ordained whatever comes to pass, and we have to learn how to live under his sovereign or his ordained will. And so you've got these kind of two ways God's will is spoken about in Ecclesiastes, his commanded and his sovereign. And I think those begin to speak to how we navigate situations like the listener's asking about.
There's a portion of Ecclesiastes 3 that illustrates what you're identifying here as God's sovereign will. Could I read a few verses of that for us? At the beginning of the chapter, it begins by saying, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace." And then further down in the chapter, verses 14 and 15 say, "I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away."
I can remember the first time I studied this, and I studied it in order to teach it. And I had assumed, I'd read it, in my devotional time, and I had assumed that what this meant when it said, like, there's a time for this and a time for this. I assumed that what that meant was like, there's a right time to go to war, and there's a right time for peace, and you got to figure out, is this the right time for war or is this the right time for peace? And there's a right time to keep silent, and there's a right time to speak up, and you got to kind of figure out what the right time is. There's a right time to seek, and there's a right time to just let loss happen. You got to figure out. And then I studied it. and the term season and time, the first verse is, "For everything there's a season and a time, for every matter under the sun." It actually means an appointed season or an appointed time. And to use our language from a minute ago, it means God is sovereignly ordained that there will be some seasons under the sun, that is, in human history, that happens until Christ returns and the kingdom of God comes. There will be some seasons where they are seasons of war, and there will be some seasons that are seasons of peace. And there will be some seasons when it's a time to mourn. They're just seasons of grief. And there are some seasons that are seasons of joy, times to dance. And God has established the seasons under which we live, and he ordains sovereignly the seasons under which we live. And then that really comes out in the last verses you read. The author of Ecclesiastes says, "I perceive that whatever God does endures forever." And now he's assigning God agency to the assigning of these seasons. He's naming God as the one who causes these seasons to come and to go. Nothing can be added to it nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. And so the response to these seasons is like, we fear God who has established these seasons. I can I can think about right now, I've been reading through Winston Churchill's World War II memoirs, and what I'm just struck by is how much they tried to avoid World War II, and they didn't want the war to come. And yet, because of circumstances beyond their control, it came, and it came upon them. And then I'm thinking about, like, there's a time for war and a time for peace. There's a sense that with these seasons are out of our control, and Kohelet is saying that we just have to attribute them to, like, God has sovereignly allowed these seasons to come and these seasons to go. This is now speaking to what our questioner asked, like, so is it just a season where we have to wait on God? Is there nothing else we can do? Do we just have to wait on God?
So in some sense, you're saying Ecclesiastes is helping us see that there are two ways that God wills: his sovereign will and his commanded will. And his sovereign will, as in this passage that we just read, is whatever he has determined will happen. And we don't know that. We don't necessarily know beforehand what season is in front of us. But it is within God's sovereign and ordained will. And then his commanded will is what he tells us to do, what he holds us accountable for doing, that's been revealed to us through his law and according to the way that he made the universe to work, according to these biblical wisdom principles that help us understand that there is a moral basis for life and for these decisions, which is why we're wrestling with this.
That's right. And Ecclesiastes refers to that as well, and the wisdom of living under God's commands. So, for example, in Ecclesiastes 5:10, Solomon says, "He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income." That's like a classic proverbial saying, wealth and money don't satisfy. And so don't put your ultimate hope in wealth and money. That's part of God's commanded will. "Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the bosom of fools." That's Ecclesiastes 7:9. There is real wisdom in not being a person who is prone to anger and not letting anger get kind of lodged in your heart. Ecclesiastes 12:1 says, "Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth." Like, there's real wisdom in learning to live under God's rule and reign when you're a young person, and then to carry that on through all your days. So, multiple examples to the goodness here of just simply learning and living by God's commanded will.
So we've established that there are these two senses in which God wills: his sovereign will and his commanded will. Now, what do we do with that understanding?
Right. Well, those are just both mentioned throughout Ecclesiastes, that there are certain things you cannot control. They're just times and seasons that God has established. And it's also mentioned throughout Ecclesiastes that it's good to keep God's commandments and live according to what he said. And it emphasizes both waiting on God, to use our questioner's language, but it also emphasizes human agency and decision-making, and both of those are emphasized in Ecclesiastes, because there's kind of this back and forth. And then the book literally ends like this. These are the last two verses of Ecclesiastes in chapter 12. "The end of the matter, all has been heard." The end of the matter, all has been heard. Here's what it all boils down to: fear God and keep his commandments. Now, fear God is Solomon's phrase for learn to live under the seasons and times that he's established, and accept that he is sovereignly in control of all things that come to pass. That's what it means to fear God, and to realize that not everything is controlled by your actions and your decisions and your choices, but there's just a learning to live with God's sovereign will. So, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments. And keep his commandments is the other part. Like, do what you have agency to do, and do it in a way that lives within the law and the wisdom that God has given us. For this is the whole duty of man. The whole duty of man is fear God and keep his commandments. And then he says in verse 14, for God will bring every deed into judgment. That is, he will every decision and choice that we make, he will bring into judgment at the end of history, and every secret thing, whether good or evil. The summary that I have often used to describe this is we're taught here to live by God's commanded will and to live with his sovereign will, or we might say to live under his sovereign will. So we live by his commanded will and we live with his sovereign will. And I mean something very specific with that. When we're deciding what should we do, when we're asking that question, what should I do? We consult what God has said. We consult his commanded will. But we have to also pair that with, and sometimes the choices we make don't go as we hoped they would go or that we wanted them to go. Sometimes the circumstances we find ourselves in are beyond our obvious control, and they can't be neatly tied to some choice or decision that we made. And so we have to also learn to live with or to trust God's sovereign will. And I like to say that because not only are both of those, that's the whole duty of man, is to learn how to do both of those. That's what he says in Ecclesiastes, but also it helps me say to myself things like this. When I'm asking, what do I do in this situation? I don't consult God's sovereign will. I don't go, well, I'm just waiting to see what God has sovereignly ordained to come to pass. That's not how you make decisions. How you make decisions and choices is to consult his commanded will and use your agency. And then when I'm wrestling with the mysteries of life, like why is my life gone this particular way, or how am I in this particular situation, even if I can't trace it back to some decision or choice I made, I learn to trust and to live with the ordained order that God has, times and seasons that God has made me to live under. So if I go back to this listener's question, should I wait or should I take action? Sometimes the answer is you should do both of those. There may be additional action that is within your agency to take, and it would be within the parameter of what God has commanded. And so you can take that, and you also have to wait and see what he's going to do with that. And so many circumstances we face aren't simply an either or, but they're a both and so like I would say to someone who's single and wants to meet someone to ask both questions, like, okay, I'm clearly having to live under God's sovereign will, and I need to accept that and learn how to trust him and trust what he's doing here in this season of my life. And to ask the question, like, what agency do I have? What options are open before me? And to pursue those by faith.
To pursue those by faith and within the parameters of God's commanded will, according to what we know of his commanded will, which in this specific illustration, you gave some examples earlier in our conversation of what those sorts of questions might be, like who might I date then? So if I take steps to pursue this, what would be the way in which I navigate who I'm going to date? That would be a way to apply God's commanded will, those principles of biblical wisdom, to this specific situation.
That's right. And the questioner mentioned here, I'm often advised, I should try online dating or should I try local meetups? Those are two options. There may be other ways you can go about meeting someone. Maybe you can ask your friends for introductions. You can let people who are good, godly, wise people who you know, let them know that you're interested in meeting someone and that you would, if they run across someone, you would keep you in mind. There's all kinds of things you can do. So sometimes we can get limited in our imagination of what we can actually do. And I find often there is some agency we have in a situation, even if it may not be the obvious steps in front of us. There's some agency that we have in a situation. And there's also a sense of just mystery in trusting God with the results of that.
Mm-hmm. I think to what you said earlier, about the two not being exclusive of the other, that often when we're in a season of waiting, we can exercise what agency we have, and we are still waiting to see how God will move, what the outcome of that will be. And so in any of those situations, we don't know what God's sovereign will, his ordained will is. But we can say, what choices are in front of me? How can I creatively imagine what next steps I might be able to take? So if you have some clear options and you can exercise your agency, then you're encouraging us to do that. I would say if you don't, there might legitimately be situations in which you don't know what your options are. You don't know how to exercise your agency. So you may need to seek God and seek wise counsel. You mentioned, even in the illustration we're using right now, ask friends to keep you in mind. Ask for other input. See who in your life might give you some wise input that would help you imagine things that you might not otherwise. And then you may have a clear next step to take.
Right. There is a nice balance in Ecclesiastes. And I don't mean like finding the perfect balanced spot. I just mean like doing both at the same time. There's just this balanced double pursuit in Ecclesiastes of my heart is really surrendered to God and to how he's ordered my life and to his sovereignty. And it might be helpful in a minute to talk about why that's a good thing, why God's sovereignty is a good thing, even when it's very, very perplexing. And there's also emphasized in Ecclesiastes, I'm going to keep God's commands and I'm going to follow the dictates of wisdom, and I have real agency and responsibility to do that. So I just always encourage everyone to ask that question. I am finding that I have a lot of pastoral conversations with people who have defaulted to throwing their hands up and just kind of waiting for God to do something that doesn't involve them at all. I'm finding more and more people doing that, just like, well, I've tried to do something about this and I can't, there's really nothing more I can do. And so I'm just waiting on the Lord. And that is sometimes true. Like when we're sick and we've done everything we know to do to try to recover from that sickness, there is sometimes just I've done all I can do. I've just got to wait on the Lord. If you're in a broken relationship and you've, by wisdom, pursued every avenue of wisdom to try to repair that relationship, and it can't be repaired, there is sometimes I'm just going to have to trust the Lord. But your agency might now be directed in a different way. So you still have agency. It's just going to not be agency that can repair the relationship. Like there may not be anything you can do to repair the relationship, but there may be agency you have in other areas, like I'm going to form new relationships, or I'm going to choose to forgive this person and move on with, the other things in my life that God has put in front of me. So I may not have agency to go and solve that as I would want to solve it, and I've got to trust God with that, but I do have agency in other ways. And so I think the dictates of wisdom is always like trust God's sovereignty and rely on the goodness of his sovereignty. I think we should talk about why his sovereignty is good, and also continue to give yourself to what you have agency to do. Someone who's sick and who's suffering and who may not be able to heal that sickness, they've tried everything, they can still say, well, I've still got life and breath left in my lungs, so what am I going to do with whatever degree of life and energy I have left? What am I going to give myself to? And to go and give themselves to that. I have a friend right now who's battling cancer, and she's done everything she should do to battle cancer. And there is an element now of we're just waiting to see how the Lord answers our prayers as she battles cancer. And yet there's nothing else I could say to her like, well, you should also do this and this and this and this. Everyone would say you're doing all you can do, and we're trusting God's sovereignty and we're asking him to heal. But she is so attuned to, even though she is sick, even though she is in bed some days and can't get out of bed, she is so attuned to what she has agency to do. It's amazing to me. I got an email from her yesterday telling me how she had been praying for me that day from bed. And she even says, I'm on my knees in spirit. And then she's like, sometimes I'm just on my back, and she has not lost agency to pray. She's not lost agency to ask God, and not just to pray for her healing. She's interceding for the church. She's interceding for the people in her life, and she knows she still has agency and capacity to do that, even if she doesn't have capacity to do much else. So I find that to be just an incredibly beautiful picture of what Ecclesiastes is advising us to do.
Well, this sort of scenario, when your friend, for instance, finds herself in a really hard and, in human terms, inexplicable situation and season of suffering, that would be an illustration of something you said earlier, living with or submitting to God's sovereign will, and yet still living by his commanded will, which has also these positive implications for then the way she is choosing to continue to live and exercise her agency, even in a very difficult situation. And so a moment ago, you said, let's discuss why living with, submitting to God's sovereign will is still good for us. But I do have a follow-up question. The teacher in Ecclesiastes indicates that he understands that God's sovereign will includes this whole range of things that he experiences as good, and then even he uses the word evil. All of that is a result of God's sovereign will or ordained will as he understands it. And then that makes me think also of the account of Job. Job sustained terrible things, tragedies, lost his family in a very tragic way, all his wealth, even his health. But then there's this verse in Job that says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. So the Lord hath given and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And there's a similar sentiment echoed in Ecclesiastes. And I think that also is a demonstration of the way that we often experience God's sovereign will.
In Ecclesiastes 3, right after saying there's a time and a season, for all these things under heaven, Solomon says, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. There is a lot that he says right there. He says, first of all, God has made everything beautiful in its time. And what he's getting there to is a similar thing that Paul references in Romans chapter 8. He causes all things to work together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. So of all these times and seasons under heaven that he's just mentioned, a time for peace and a time for war, a time to build up and a time to tear down, of these things, he's saying God takes the fullness of that and he weaves it all together and makes it beautiful. The tapestry of all of that woven together is beautiful in its time, and he means time of eternity now. And so somehow God works all things together for good.
That sounds like Romans 8:28.
That's Romans 8:28. He's made everything beautiful in its time. And then he says also, he's put eternity into man's heart. And he means that we long to see it all worked out, and we have this innate sense that like this all has to be serving a bigger, greater, better purpose. And so when we say God makes all things good and beautiful in its time, we're like, I really want that to be true. That's eternity in our heart, right? But then he adds this, yet eternity is in our heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to end. Yet God has put eternity into our heart and a longing for all things to be made new and good. And yet he's done it in a way that we can't see yet how it all works out. We can't understand and know it all. So there's an element of mystery in terms of how it's all going to work out there. And this is why he says we have to fear God. We have to learn how to live with and trust him when there are sovereign circumstances that we didn't accept, didn't choose, our choices and decisions didn't necessarily contribute to, but God is going to even make those things beautiful in its time. We don't yet see it, so we have to trust Him.
That's a beautiful explanation, and also something really hard to actually reckon with. All right, I want to go back to the last line of our listener's question. Our listener asks, how do you discern times to trust God's sovereignty versus intervene through human action? And in this discussion of God's sovereign will that we live with and God's commanded will, which we live by or according to, I think our response is both, that we always need to exercise trust in God's sovereign will throughout all of life, and to trust that what we receive from His hand, and that means we will experience good and bad, and trust that He's making all things beautiful in His time, a time that is beyond our full ability right now to comprehend. And He's given us agency. And so often when we live by His commanded will, when we're making a decision that even in the moment might not feel clear, if you're doing that, utilizing the wisdom that God has given you, revealed to us, then you can take a step and make a choice. You still don't know the outcome of that. And so we continue to trust in each decision, in each step that we take. When we exercise our agency, we continue to trust in God's sovereign will.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. Most of the time, we're doing both. We are both trusting God's sovereignty and we're exercising human agency. The way the question's worded, I don't know if this is what the questioner intended, but the way it's worded seems to suggest that maybe we have to do one or the other of those. Like now I have to trust God's sovereignty, or now I have to intervene with human agency. And actually, it's both. In most situations, we're doing both. There may be certain circumstances where there's a slight accent on one or the other. So if you've done all that you know to do, then there may be an accent on I'm trusting God's sovereignty. And if you have legitimate options that are open to you, and there could be an accent on pursue those by faith and see what God does.
All right. Well, Hunter, thank you. Thank you to our listener who sent in this question.
Great question.
Yes, great question. This was a fun discussion, even in the afternoon on Thursday.
That's right.
I think we made it okay.
Yeah.
And to those of you listening, we love hearing from you. So if you have a question or if you have a suggestion about what you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future, send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.